Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right, we are back for another glorious recording. Today, as we continue on our trauma-informed journey, we're going to be looking at military and veteran trauma. Is that sounds accurate?
Yeah. So I just want to maybe start out. I always have this conversation this way. I'm not a veteran, and I do not have any direct family members that have served, but I am very excited working with this group, love working with this group, but just always want to kind of um, give a shout out to those who have served and are serving, just because there is this term called stolen valor where people pretend like they've served in the military. And so we want no part of that on this podcast. So just want to maybe throw out that quick disclaimer. And so I appreciate Tiffany, you being willing for this to be one of our episodes, just because this is something I know that we both have worked with in the past and present, but that's something I get really excited about working with and talking about.
Yeah. It's I think too, as we're talking about it, kind of setting out that warning as well that potentially may or may not be some triggering things that get talked about. We can be, I think military trauma in of itself can be really hard to talk about sometimes. But it's also important to make sure that it's part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate that disclaimer. I would say I'm just looking over the notes. I know Tiffany and I try to record live each time we look over. I don't know if we'll get into any specific uh big T trauma stuff. We will talk about like triggers, like so things that are usually triggers for folks. But yeah, just to give that, I appreciate that, Tiffany, to just disclaimer for those listening of maybe what kind of day that you're having. So um one of the things I just want to start off by sharing is that like we all go through some levels of trauma in some of the work we do, some more than others. So I think when we think about the military, we understand that there's a likelihood of trauma being occurred in that space, same as like EMTs or police officers, therapists. Actually, one of the more dangerous jobs, if my understanding is correctly, is the folks that are working on power lines and like setting them up. It's a very dangerous job. Actually, a lot of fatalities every year. Construction, just so I think we all know that there are different things that come with the trade. So I just want to make sure that we're not framing this that anyone that's ever served in the military has trauma. That's actually kind of a common misunderstanding. So typically, there are some distinctions made within the veteran community of like combat service and service in a combat zone versus being deployed somewhere else that maybe is not a combat area. So maybe an example of this would be serving in Iraq was be serving in a combat zone versus maybe if you were in the Air Force or Army and maybe stationed over in Germany, not a country we've been at war with for a very long time. And so just there's some differences between the service and even the roles within the military. The military is a very large organization, so there are folks that are doing, you know, Navy SEALs going on missions, but there's also folks like working in tech and working maybe stationed in other bases. So I know that, Tiffany, for maybe you and I, this may sound like very common knowledge, but I just encounter a lot that some of our therapist colleagues or folks who don't have a direct connection to the military don't really know what they don't know. So is there anything else maybe you'd throw out about folks that maybe things they kind of don't know that they don't know?
At least from like my professional experience kind of working with veterans, um, that I've encountered is that frustration of like, and this just goes for like the general public too, not just necessarily like our colleagues, like that unlike spoken expectation that it's just like going to be super easy or expected some sort of ease of being able to easily transition back into quote unquote normal life, and things of that nature, and kind of like that dismissiveness around of like, you know, even if, we can, transition back into quote unquote a normal lifestyle, there is something about, quote unquote normal life that doesn't feel normal for us anymore. And sometimes that can get overlooked and cause unnecessary pain and frustration within that community.
Yeah, there can be just some tension. And I think just again misunderstandings about like what, and I just feel like if you're a veteran listening to this, you please message me or email me or whatever you contact just to tell me if I messed this up. But I have found talking with some of my veteran folks that it seems like different eras have different challenges with this. So sometimes it's like, oh, this perfectly translates. You just slide right back in, no adjustments at all. It's like the stereotype. And then other times it's like, oh man, none of this translates. Like there's no, and it's like, probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. Um, and like, why would we? Why you're maybe like you said you're gonna talk about military trauma or like what? And we're sitting here talking, but this is a part of that life, the structure, and so we have to sometimes kind of understand the structure of what someone's gone through to even know how to help them. Um, so this is just I think I also want to maybe throw out one more caveat in this, Tiffany, of just that um, sometimes I will get asked like, well, hey, do you work at the VA since you work with veterans so much? And my answer is no. And then sometimes there's this very uncomfortable pause where they kind of have some maybe assumptions about what that means, like what I maybe carry myself as like a person. So I just want to throw out like just a very general disclaimer. I want everyone that has VA benefits and they like that system to be able to use that system. And if you're not a veteran or have family, like the VA system is completely free. If you've served in the military, honorable, neutral discharge, you're able to get all of your medical care for free. And that's an amazing thing that they all deserve. And there are some fantastic work that is done in the VA. We could sit here all day and talk about interventions that were rooted in the VA, but the biggest one is EMDR. So EMDR is red hot in therapy. So many therapists doing it. Any therapist that is trained in EMDR, like you have been impacted by the VA medical system and how they do interventions because they are the ones that push that early, do a lot of the data and evidence to support that treatment. So I'm throwing that out there. There is the VA and they do some great work there. At the same time, you have to understand that there are folks who have gone through traumas and then sometimes have healthcare trauma and they are in this giant system and maybe some of the trauma is being in that system at all, so they will never interact with that system. Another piece of this is maybe they've had less than ideal experiences. We all will have those at some point, but maybe they've tried to go and get therapy at the VA and it was just not the fit that they were looking for. So those are the folks that then, as a therapist outside of the VA, that I will then work with. So just, and I would say pretty much most therapists working with veterans really do try to have this conversation. So there's like a gap. I will also say the VA is funding by the tunes of millions of dollars trying to get more therapists comfortable working with veterans because they know that there are millions of veterans that are never going to interact with the VA system. However, they still want to serve them. So you may have different feelings about the VA, our listeners, but I do think that's quite the mission of like you're going to pump millions of dollars in to help people you're there to serve. that will never actually come in a formal way and interact with you. There are not many healthcare organizations that do anything like that. Tiffany, anything I'm missing? I know I'm getting a little excited, so I'm probably jumping a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that pretty much covers up the kind of the umbrella of the VA. I know personally, you know, some family members that have had negative interactions with the VA. So there are caveats, you know, to like some of them feel like some VA facilities are better than others. So like very relatable to what you're saying and like helping people understand like the VA can be great and the VA can also not be great depending on personal experience and like allowing people to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think that was a very well-rounded answer. And so that's where I'm just wanting to hold space for if you have a positive view of the VA or a less than positive, like that both can actually be true at the same time. Uh, at the same time, like there are great therapists, there are crappy therapists. And so where I just want to make sure I'm not like, if you go outside the VA, your likelihood is so much better. The other thing I'll just throw out is therapy is pretty regimented inside of the VA healthcare system because they're chasing evidence-based treatment, which is fantastic. We should all do that. Um, as a neurodivergent person, I get a lot of neurodivergent veterans who that just was not working for them the way that was getting approached. And I'm not saying the VA therapists don't try, and that's not what I'm saying, but they really don't have as much freedom in that system by design, so that everything's kind of within a certain um, range. So all of that being said, why don't we just maybe dive in a little bit? So one of the things I think about, we all kind of have this general understanding with trauma that folks maybe struggle with feelings of shame, feelings of isolation. So I think one of the challenges when we think about right out of the gate a veteran coming back out of maybe a traumatic experience is they may be going back to a family that they don't have family members who have served. And even if they have family members who have served, they didn't very likely serve with their family. You know, like they may have a brother in the same branch, but they did not go through the same experiences. And so it can just feel very lonely and isolating. And also, like, as you could probably imagine, if you have gone through some big T traumas, things that no one even wants to watch in a movie, that it's very hard to want to talk about. And I may just throw out, if you take nothing else from this podcast, but you're listening, never, ever ask a veteran, did you kill anyone? Hey, what's your body count? You know what? Like, did you see combat? Like, it's a very offensive question. And I honestly don't think you are for sure triggering them. And I mean, and this is just maybe an example. Like I've had clients tell me that that's happened at like church little after church. Hey, how are you? Where are you going for lunch? Hey, did you see any combat? And like, you just have to imagine, like some of these folks have seen combat, and it's just not something you like dive into, you know, and want to maybe necessarily talk about. And so yeah,
Yeah.
at Tiffany's face, if you guys could see it, it's
I'm just over here, what the fucking, like, why would you, I don't want to be that shitty ass person, but my brain is literally like, why the fuck would you ask that
yeah.
question to someone? Like, that is not ever an appropriate question ever, 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 ever ask. Like, ever. There is no valid reason to ever ask a person that question.
I think we have perhaps gotten too comfortable, like with the no filter. Oh, everything's open. It's like I do think it's wonderful that mental health can be so open. We can talk about things, and at the same time, like not everybody should have to do that. And so I would imagine folks who listening probably wouldn't ask this question, but sometimes we just don't understand like what that's asking. Like for example, like if you ask a therapist, have any of your clients ever died? Like one, like if the answer is yes, their faces are coming into my head and I'm picturing them. And like we may be having like a totally different conversation, and now I'm having to sort. And it's on me to have my own wounds sorted, but like, you know, it's not a pleasant question. It's like asking a police officer, have you ever shot someone? Like, and so I just think like being informed on that front of like just you know, and also I would maybe say some folks don't kind of go at the speed of the person. So they're people. That's not the only piece of their identity. But you wouldn't go on a date with someone. Hopefully not. I should say hopefully not, right? You wouldn't go on a date and be like, "Hey, so tell me about what you do." And like someone just says, "Oh, you know, like I work at this company, very general, but now I'm doing this." Like, "Oh, well, tell me more about that. Did you ever do?" Like, it would be uncomfortable, especially if someone like kept coming back or fixating. And so that question is not about the veteran. That's about your morbid curiosity and wanting to go. And so you could probably find a podcast or a video or scratch that somewhere else. But this is the thing that people don't exist for our entertainment. It's people. And so I think just like really having the honor. Now, so I'm throwing this caveat, don't do that. But also some of veterans really want to share their stories and talk about some of the things they've gone through. And so if you've invited them or they've asked to speak, you know, you can go at their speed. So I don't want people to think they can't ask about service, but there are like certain questions to maybe do or not act. And so I wanted to just give that shout out because I think maybe sometimes people think in therapy, like we just do this all the time. Like we can ask things, but like, you know, Tiffany, like if I came to you as the client and I haven't served, but let's say I did serve, you're probably not asking me every single week. So hey, about that incident with the bomb, like you're not gonna do it that way. I can't imagine. Like you're probably gonna let me lead that discussion and speed.
Yeah, there is for sure a right and a wrong way to create a safe space for veterans to be able to feel comfortable if they decide to share their experiences with people. And there is for sure a right and a wrong way to follow up and ask questions and be interested and, for their story and their experiences and things of that nature.
So just one of the things, and with that, just with that fully in mind, it just really felt like that is a very helpful takeaway. Um, Combat can be a lot of different things. So I wanted to just maybe read this. It's from the McLean Hospital has a very wonderful resource list about trauma and veteran trauma, and so some of the. But I love how they've said this. When military members serve in a war zone, they live under a constant state of threat. They may have witnessed people being severely injured or killed. They may have been severely injured themselves in the line of duty. Once service members return home, they may struggle with difficult memories from combat. At the same time, they may be recovering from serious physical injuries. It can also be hard to turn down the levels of vigilance they maintained while serving. So I have not served, and I'm not going to pretend that I even understand all of the things that folks in the military are trained to do. But they are extremely skilled and talented at assessing situations because it's a survival thing. It's a part of their training. You could imagine if you actually saw combat and things that validated why you need that, and then you come back to Cincinnati, Ohio, uh, and you are in stop start traffic and all these things are going on and someone has a car that's backfiring, that you could be triggered and feel very like you now need to like watch and see and kind of notice what's going on. So that's kind of what we're talking about with like the
Mhm.
challenges of
Yeah.
adjusting.
I think too, I know we're not quite there yet, but I feel like it kind of flows with what you're saying. A myth to keep in mind, like as veterans are like coming in and adjusting, um, don't make the assumption that they all have PTSD. Not all of them will. It's a significant concern, but there's a lot of different factors that can play into like if someone will be diagnosed or not diagnosed with PTSD.
Yeah, I love that you said that. Even folks that have experienced combat, like that doesn't mean they automatically have PTSD. I love that. I really appreciate you sharing that, Tiffany. And I also think about there's just different like levels of like symptoms and like things and just all of it. So yeah, I think just maybe just not assuming anything would be a great way to kind of know I saw some research, this section from the Ohio Department of Veteran Affairs, and they were talking about how the rates of PTSD compared to the general public are not any more or less, it's about the same. And so some of the things they talk about is there is so much support and resources for veterans, not that they have to take them, but there's so many different options that typically folks who want that support are able to get connected to it. The other shout out I would maybe have is I don't want to have any veterans listening to this feeling shame. Some folks don't realize they're carrying that, and then years later are like, oh, this impacted me, which we've had thousands of clients go into therapy every day that are not veterans for very similar reasons. Like, oh, I didn't realize this impacted me. So that's kind of what, there's just a lot of different things that can be happening. And I think that just kind of one of the other maybe common misunderstandings that I think people don't fully appreciate sometimes about the veteran community is it's a supportive community. It's like living in a small town. Like it's like, hey, can I borrow your mower? Yeah, absolutely. Do you need help mowing? Hey, how are you doing? Like it's that, because you're like living, serving, and working alongside your community for extended periods of time, going through a lot. So you can imagine like they have very tight relationships. You may have only known someone for 3 months, but you served together in Iraq for 3 months. That's just a different intensity level. Like Tiffany, I think you and I are very close, but you and I have not served in a combat zone together. And I would imagine that that is just a different tightness, like of what maybe like you go through together and then support folks with.
I would say, it's a whole different level of just blind trust to some degree of like understanding and trusting that this other human is going to help keep me safe. And I have to put my trust in that. Like that's a whole different connection that some of us will never experience.
Yeah. And that's where I just think like there's a lot of healing within that community from community support. But I kind of just wanted to throw that out because one of the very common challenges for folks coming back from deployment and kind of back into family life and just not like civilian life is survivor's guilt. So this is again, just giving a shout out to the McLean Hospital. So I just want to read this piece. People in the military learn teamwork and develop a sense of responsibility for peers. This can lead to shame if members of the same unit are injured or perish. Due to the strong bonds between military service members, loss of a fellow service member can be especially painful. I can't think of any veteran I've ever talked to, combat veteran to be specific, that has ever not brought up that they feel this guilt that they made it. Sometimes I've heard it said this way that the pain is how I remember them and keep it going. Like they want to almost keep that going to keep their memory alive, which I think is like sad and beautiful all at like the same time. Yeah. So very common secondary part. I think one of the things that we don't always think about is a term I'm really interested in. I'm sure we'll come back to this one, Tiffany, is moral injury. And so not everybody knows what this term is, but I think it's a very interesting term. So I'll just read this. Moral injury is a reaction to trauma that military personnel may experience. This complex emotional wound can happen when someone behaves in a way that goes against their moral beliefs. Moral injury often occurs when a person has few options under difficult circumstances. An example of this would be soldiers can experience moral injury if they unintentionally hurt a civilian as a part of their mission. As a result, they can feel deeply ashamed and isolated within society. Another, I think, good example of everything within the military is there is a video that the STAR behavioral health providers do in their trainings that shows one of the veterans, and I'm not going to make up his name, but he talks about that he was tech support on one of the aircraft carriers. They carried out a mission. It was a bombing mission. They had a target, no civilian casualties, but they carried out their target. And he explains that when the planes landed, mission was a success. People were clapping and kind of like cheering. And he just could not, like, it just really it created this moral injury for him of like, we just, killed someone. It was our job, but like, why are we celebrating that we did that? A non-military example of this is during COVID. In the hospitals, a lot of healthcare workers were faced with impossible situations of needing to decide who gets a ventilator, or who got the necessary attention or resources based off of probability of success of treatment, which is just horrible. And so yeah. So just those are examples of moral injury. I think, Tiffany, we've talked about that before, but anything you would maybe add on moral injury?
Oh, I feel like that's a really hard one. I guess like what comes to brain to brain to my brain to my brain when you talk about moral injury, is more of that like that civilian aspect that civilians tend to have views upon towards the military and veterans, with like they are violent or dangerous people, or they should quote unquote get over it or toughen up. Um, I feel like that's what comes to mind for me because it feels like sometimes, not everyone, but there can be this societal diminishing of like the morality of the person because they're not tough enough to deal with it when they
Oh,
chose to do it, or like they're dangerous now that you chose to take this
oh,
path in life, and it can be very like disheartening kind of to like see that people have that view
yeah,
when there's so many different reasons people choose to be a veteran, and sometimes, maybe they didn't have that
yeah.
choice to
Gosh, I
be a
mean,
veteran.
gosh, I'm having my own reactions to that, and like, I do think that's a very like what you're saying is not an accurate, Tiffany. That some people feel this way. Well, I think a lot of times, folks, a huge percentage of folks in the military are career military, where I mean, it runs in their family. So, like, your dad was in the Navy, you joined the Navy, your brother and sister joined the Navy, and so it's like a family tradition, and there's a lot of honor in that. Another option is like folks needed a career and a job and a way to move their life forward, and so they picked that. But I think we have to be very careful putting the politics of the moment or issues on folks who have served. Because, like, for example, you may disagree with something the US military is doing, but if someone was, I don't know, Ohio National Guard, like all they've been doing is, well, not all, but they've been going to drill once a month and been ready to like protect, help with national disasters like a hurricane, a tornado, or something. So I do think we have to be careful, but I have a very strong reaction to the statement they should just get over it. Because I like don't think anyone should be told that, in the sense of like, well, it's still bothering them, so that's a them problem or something. Like, especially folks who have sacrificed a lot, because you don't know what you're going to be stationed or see or do in the military. So they're making huge sacrifices. So I really try to keep it PG, but I'm like, if someone actually feels that way, I think like I would really want to have a conversation, because I think I could hear them say, well, lots of people have problems, or there's all this resources for help. I would maybe challenge like there's so many resources for veterans because they need them and because they are going through adversity and need assistance. And I think folks who have sacrificed for literally all of us deserve that. But um, I'm going to try to take a sip of my coffee, because if I say more, I probably won't be as polite about it.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I just want to validate your experience because personally, every time I hear someone like either in passing or like in my life in general, like make those kind of statements, like it's very hard not to be like, I'm gonna start throwing some fists at people.
Yeah, I'm
Like it's
picturing
just
people. Yeah, I'm picturing people I know, and I don't think I have the right to tell anyone else's story. I will, maybe from a very zoomed out perspective, talk about how heartbreaking I think it is for the veterans that came back from Vietnam and how they were treated. Um, like it's heartbreaking, to me, because that was, and I'm not saying I agree with the invasion of Vietnam. That's not what I'm saying when I say this. But like, those men did not decide what the military was doing. They did not make those decisions. And when, like, those veterans, when they came back, like, they were spat on, things thrown at them. Um, The only general thing I feel like I can say is I know someone that shared with me that they felt lucky they came home in the night because they didn't have to deal with that. Versus you think about today, most of the time people are like, they have the video and it's heartwarming, there's balloons, and people are like, oh my God, you know. Like, and so I think my heart is breaking because like we need to help not just veterans, but veterans deserve our help and they deserve some extra space and support. So, but I could hear maybe someone thinking they've set a trap for us, Tiffany, because they said, well, other people have problems too. And it's like, yeah. And also, like saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that like white lives don't. It's saying, hey, we're taking a moment to recognize this group for the specific things going on. And that doesn't mean that like those other things don't matter, but we can take attention to take care of it. And I almost feel like maybe this is a good like kind of pause point because the next stuff I kind of have is like family and like community stuff in this. So maybe this is something we can come back to, Tiffany, just because I think it's one we probably could talk about a long time, but I think this may be a good spot to kind of pause and just maybe come back to the family side, community side of this.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to kind of like put a push pin in it for today, and continue this conversation in our next episode, so that we can, you know, continue talking about like very real topic of military and veteran trauma and ways that like it manifests and the way that we can kind of help support that community.
And if anyone listening has anything they'd like to add or comments on anything, we'd love to hear it. I just don't feel like, even folks we've met not as therapists, that we have earned the right to tell their stories in this space. So that's where like if you know any veteran that wants to tell their story, and wants to talk a little bit about this, not because they have to, but I know Tiffany and I would love to hear from them, and we will make that time and space. But again, with them wanting to do that and have that space, we're not fishing here. We just want to support how we can.
Yeah, if anyone would want to come share, we would be more than happy to host you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.